Hi there everybody and welcome to Sean Cameron Photographic. Thank you so much for joining me. After testing the Z9 with rugby, birds and finding our own dogs in that controlled environment last time, I really felt it was about time to use it for the day job. In other words, a couple of different paid events. Now I had contrasting weather for each day and I'll be talking about that, the ISO, my experience of using the Z9 with its highs, lows and shocks, as well of course as that all famous focus tracking system. During the video sequences I've cut out the sky and the floor bits where I've been carrying the camera around because especially in the first part of the video I had to move around a lot, often to gain a better position, sometimes to get out of the way. The first day was a scent work training day and it was held at a beautifully restored railway station. The aim of this photography is to capture the dogs as they find a scent, and with some dogs it's easy and with others it can be split second. I'm also looking for images that capture the venue and the expressions of the dogs. Now whilst the dogs are working, everyone's very quiet, not wanting to distract or disturb them. Though this one seems to be keeping a very wary eye on me. Now one of the very many Z9 features that I was excited about was the capability to shoot silently with a camera that has the technical power and speed to achieve this without any of the smearing or rolling shutter problems that I previously experienced with other cameras. To be honest, I'd always given up and switched back to the mechanical shutter. So I was feeling pretty confident with this camera. I've got to say though, it's really strange to shoot silently. As you can see, the tracking's doing a pretty good job of following the head, and I'm jumping between wide area, large and 3D, mainly to show you something, but I'll get back to that in a minute. Having started with a fairly low ISO, I put it up to 4000 to see if it would become noisy. It didn't, and so that's another box ticked. Using the Z9 all day was no more tiring than the D5, so if you're used to a DSLR and a battery grip, or one of Nikon's single figure range, D3, D4, etc., then the Z9 will feel pretty familiar. It sits comfortably in the palm and it balances with the Z70-200 lens really well. I completely forgot that the viewfinder is electronic, and I think the way the info rotates when you're shooting vertically is pure genius. It makes you wonder why it hasn't happened before and how on earth did we read it with other cameras? Now back to the focus modes. I had the camera set up so it used 3D as standard and a press of the lens function button switches it to wide area large. I'd like to thank a couple of my subscribers, especially Ray Sweeting, for steering me towards a guy called Hudson Henry. He does great videos and this is my version of his setup. Although he uses a front function button as well as the AF on button, I found that because my hand rests comfortably on the Z70-200 function button, I adapted his excellent advice for myself. I'll leave a link to the video below. Back to the dogs. I'm finding the whole experience quite relaxing. I can concentrate on my position and plan where the dog's going to go next. I'm largely leaving the camera to do its own thing. However, that complacency probably stopped me from using a shallower depth of field because I didn't notice. But I'm enjoying using the Z9 and I'm adapting to this new way of working. Of course, whilst all the time trying to keep out of the way of the dogs and the handlers. I was also trying not to step off the platform. Can you imagine the embarrassment? As you've probably noticed, I've upped the ISO again, this time to 8000. And all in all, I was pretty impressed. There was very little noise, and even with the black dogs, I can't see anything to complain about. I'll test it further later on in this video when I go indoors for some fast action dog agility. Now, I'm not sure whether this one is on a scent or whether it's after somebody's discarding sandwich, but I'm seriously impressed at the speed the camera attains focus, even when he shoves his head in the bin. As you know, the Z9 has no shutter blackout. I don't know whether you can see it on the screen, I'm sure you can, but in certain light you can just spot the flicker. It's not in the slightest bit off-putting when you're taking the images. In fact, I've got to admit I didn't even notice it at the time. Now, I don't like being that close to the action, so at lunchtime I put the Z7200 lens away in the van and fitted my 300mm f2.8 to the Z9, using of course the FTZ adapter. I was certain it wouldn't make little or no difference to either the quality or the focus tracking because I've tested that before. I just got to the furthest point from the car park and my camera bag when one of the handlers appeared with the most gorgeous puppy for me to photograph, so how could I refuse? The only problem was we could only find a small cramped area that was available, and I would have much preferred the Z7200 to be absolutely honest. I didn't have the greatest setup, but I was reasonably confident that at least I'd get some good portraits. Sadly, no chance of getting those shots when the puppy just explodes into action though. Yes, of course the camera got them, I never doubted it. Shame on you for believing me. And it didn't just get them once, it got them again, and again, and again. And that's the funny thing about this camera. Every time you think you've missed, well, you just haven't. Okay, so no system is infallible, but for me that's a good thing. Surely there has to be some skill left in the job, even if this camera has nearly made that redundant. And remember the portraits? How are these? And don't forget, all these images are straight out of the camera. Of course I'd normally edit them before my customers even get to see them, but I wanted to show you just how good the originals are. Now the afternoon went pretty much the same as the morning. The Z9 worked perfectly with both the FTZ and the 300. And of course that's no surprise given the performance with the puppy, and you've seen those pictures. It had been a pretty sunny day all day, and the first thing I'd noticed was that the Z9 seems to have a tendency to overexpose, blowing out the whites slightly. It's worth remembering, but to be quite honest, the D5 has the same tendency, so I know that it's easily corrected as long as they're not lost completely. Normally it's just a case of adjusting one slider in processing, or possibly a -1/3 of a stop exposure in the future. The second one thing I discovered was much more concerning. And that's if you're using silent mode where the camera's shooting at 20 frames a second, you've no idea how many shots you've actually taken. And the realisation that I'd taken well over 7,000 in one day was, to put it mildly, a bit of a shock. I'll tell you what, the next day's editing was a long one. Anyway, a few days later I covered a 2-day dog agility show. Now these videos are not speeded up, they're real time. You see, dog agility is a really fast moving sport. Normally my focus technique for agility is to pre-focus and then allow the dog to come into that focus area. But I knew that I'd got to test and trust the tracking. Well, I used the various modes all day without once being tempted to my normal setup. The D5 stayed in the bag largely, and I soon realised that whatever tracking mode I was in, the camera would pretty much nail the shot. That meant that I could test the camera as well as learn which settings are best and produce saleable images. Everyone's a winner. So first I tried 3D and then wide area large, but I found the fastest for attaining the dog and sticking with it was auto area AF. So that's pretty much what I stuck to all day. Even so, I wasn't sure that I'd get so many keepers with the Z9. And I was starting to feel it was a bit of a gamble to continue using it all day, and I've never chimped so much before. Chimping is when you look at the back of the camera to check the images you've just taken. It usually means you're either not confident in the settings or the camera, or possibly both, or maybe yourself, all three in my case. So I was finishing up the day indoors and I chose an ISO of 10,000 and a competitor who didn't mind me videoing him with a Ninja. Cheers, Jason. I always ask permission for these videos when I include people. The school is way too dark for decent and, more importantly, consistent images, and I wouldn't normally shoot in there, but I was interested to see how it dealt with the 10,000 ISO indoors, especially as I occasionally need to use it for indoor shows. I was quite pleased with how the camera tracked them in low light, even when I chose wide area large for no apparent reason. I think I put my finger on the button or something. I was waiting for them to come closer, and when they did, I went back to auto area. And the tracking momentarily bounced from human to dog, and then stayed there until the dog disappeared off behind the wing and Jason, and I lost it completely. But let's have a look at some stills straight out of the camera. And here are some others during that session at ISO of 8000, 10,000, 12,800 and 16,000. Thoughts? My feeling is that I'm surprised. Okay, remember that I mentioned the problem with a silent camera that's shooting more images than I can count, even if I could hear them? I tell you what, add then the temptation for those sequenced images, and it should have been no surprise that I achieved a ridiculous 12,000 photos during the first dog agility competition day. Still shocked me though. I tell you what, it's a good thing there's no shutter to wear out, because in my hands, this Tommy gun camera would be worn out in about 3 months. I can't stop taking photos with it. Okay, second day and the weather was truly appalling. Heavy rain all day. I couldn't risk using the Ninja in the rain, so I'm afraid all we have are the images. I guess the question I had to ask myself was, how would that focus tracking deal with the distraction of raindrops? Well, apparently it deals with it very well. Again, I used auto area, and this time I was using an ISO of 5000. The aperture was between f4 and f5.6, and the images are simply raw turned into JPEGs with no editing. I know I keep saying that. They aren't particularly noisy, and they're sharp, which is the most important thing. I didn't get quite as many keepers as the previous day, but enough to provide my clients with some stunning shots. You see, I aim to have at least 3 decent images of every dog that competes during the day, and about a 92% hit rate, success rate, and the camera easily achieved that. Even with the darker dogs, the camera performed well, and I loved the way it can continue to shoot sequences. But I did notice a slight quirk. If either I woke the camera or switched it back on and started shooting immediately, the images could have a slightly odd hue, until I allowed the camera to adjust. It's not a big thing, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Now, do you remember those indoor tests I did in the last video? I bet you don't. Well, thank you if you did. I promised to show you the high ISO images from the Z9, the Z6 II and the D5, and here they are. I have upped the exposure slightly in some of these pictures in post-processing as it was so dark in there, and they are slightly cropped. You know, I think that ditches any concerns I had as far as ISO is concerned, that this camera is studio and landscape only. It's not. It's a phenomenal low light sports camera, and it compares well to the other 2 cameras. A final comparison at 10,000 ISO shows the difference in white balance and exposure. Yes, the D5 looks best, but with a little tweaking, the Z9 can produce the same. And considering its other benefits, I think I need a second one. Thank you so much for joining me, and you know what I'm going to say. If you liked the video, then please like it. And if you really liked it and want to join me again, please subscribe. I really appreciate it. Now take care and see you soon. Bye.